Okay, welcome to Living Eternity Now. How did the founding fathers of the United States establish the greatest nation on the face of the earth? What ideas did they implement? What were they about? What did they do? And if we are losing our liberties as citizens of the United States, which we are, then the only way to recover that is to know what our founding fathers did. If we don't even know what they were about, then how can we recover what they had established for us? So I've been providing us with a series of studies about the founding fathers. We started with Thomas Jefferson, then Thomas Paine, Alexander Hamilton, and today we can take a look at John Adams. And today I will also include scientific solution to these problems, very specific practical solutions. So let's begin today with John Adams, referring to the slide. We see that he was really a driving force for independence in 1776. He was pivotal in making resolutions against British taxation and against regulation, kind of like nowadays we are subject to unjust laws and a highly immoral financial system. Very similar, John Adams had solutions for this. He was Washington's vice president for both terms of Washington, and he was the second president of the United States. And as you'll be noticing, these founding fathers, they were not only highly intelligent, but they were very active people as well. They implemented correct ideas with a degree of courage that is really admirable to observe. So looking more specifically at John Adams, referring to the slide, he utilized this idea of the Baron of Montesquieu, that we need to have three separate powers, the executive, legislative, and judicial, in order to avoid the accumulation of power in one place. That is to say, in order to avoid despotism. All of the founding fathers used this idea that Adams really brought up this awareness of Montesquieu. And as we've seen in prior studies with Alexander Hamilton, with Thomas Paine, they were very worried about the accumulation of power. They saw that where there is a great accumulation of power, there is a loss of liberties. That's why they established these three branches within the government. Looking at number 2, defending the right to private property. Up until this time, you didn't have a right for private property in despotism under the King of England or whatever type of power that we've seen up until the establishment, as they referred to democracy, the great experiment. And so what is the value of having the right to private property? This is very similar to number 4. Looking at point number 4, only those with private property have an interest to defend it. And nowadays, those who have taken control of the planet, those who are in power really, they want to take away the right to private property, one step at a time. For example, you can see in the purchasing of cars and motorcycles, they're doing it in such a way where you yourself, you can't even change the oil, for example, without it being done at the place where you bought the car, at the dealership. And so what's happening is the dealership is owning more and more the care of the car. There are computer and electrical parts that nobody knows how to deal with, only there at the dealership, to the point where it's becoming more practical to not even buy the car, but just to rent it from the dealerships. It's like one step at a time. This is just an example of how they would like to take away the right to private property. The evilest of men, they are completely against the Constitution of the United States. It's their biggest blockage toward complete despotism. And so this is why we need to know what our constitutional rights are and what the founding fathers were about. Looking at number 3, giving preferential value to education and moral responsibility. We've seen this with other founding fathers as well. The question that education needs to be free. We need to free up our educators to educate the youth. and not being controlled by some source with malefic intentions. And the same with moral responsibility. That is to say, to act with ethics, with the inner honesty, with the knowledge of what is good and what is not good. We have that in our being. Everybody knows what is honest and what is dishonest, because our being is truth itself. And so this question of moral responsibility that Adams is bringing up, it's essential to civilization. We must act ethically, morally. That is to say, we must base our success in honesty, because this is what true civilization is based on. It's based on truth, it's based on goodness, that is to say, acting in benefit of your fellow man, and in beauty, beautifying everything, because these three elements are the essential elements of being. And looking at the observation in the bottom, the ideal government would be aristocratic with democracy. That's why we have the Electoral College in our election system. When it is respected, it's actually quite genius. For example, if you just have popular vote, in countries, for example, where there is a lot of poor people, all you have to do as a politician is promise them food, and then you get all of their votes, even if afterwards you don't supply anyone with food, and you don't know what you're doing as a president, but you got all of the popular votes. So in order to avoid this type of thing, we have elected officials, elected representatives who are representing certain pockets of populations, and in the end, they vote for who will be the president, for example. And so it's a combination of popular vote with those who are seen to have the capacity to know what's going on and to represent his people. And so it's this combination that we use. This comes from John Adams, the whole question of the Electoral College. Now, as we've seen, all of the founding fathers were very worried about the bankers, because they saw that they are very unscrupulous, very dishonest, without moral responsibility, quite the opposite, even violent individuals. And as we notice today, they are even mentally disturbed people. And the founding fathers knew that the only way to dismantle, annihilate the system of government that they set up, which would provide a certain liberty to its citizens, would be through the issuance and domination of power. So that they were very worried about these bankers. Nowadays, the international bankers and the certain magnates of multinational corporations, they're the same people who are at the cupolas of these secret sex societies. It's always the same small group of mentally ill individuals that are dominating everything through money and through a highly immoral financial system. And the Federal Reserve, it's not federal. It's a very deceitful name. It's run by privately owned international bankers who belong to satanic secret sect societies, and through a highly dishonest financial system, they dominate nations nowadays. Abraham Lincoln, he began printing money, issuing money from the government and not from privately owned banks. They were called greenbacks. And he said, we didn't fight a 4-year bloody civil war in order to free the enslavement of a race of people, in order for these bankers to then enslave everybody. So he authorized the printing of money made by the federal government. John Kennedy did the same thing. He was printing dollars that were not being issued by what we now call the Federal Reserve, by these international private bankers. And what happened to these presidents? This shows how violent these bankers are. They're mentally disturbed people. They'll stop at nothing to control others. And the United States Constitution is the biggest barrier to their desires of controlling everything and everybody. Can you perceive how they are mentally ill? So what is the solution to this problem that we are facing today more than ever? I would like to show us a scientific study of the formidable social scientist, psychoanalyst Norberto Keppe, educator, independent physicist of Austrian Brazilian origin. He has a solution that, as you will see, is going to be absolutely necessary for us to implement so that we can return to a nation that knows how to deal with despotism. Taking a look at the slide then, look, how to fix this situation. This is a study of Norberto Keppe. Each country should print its own money and not be completely in the hands of these bankers, which our founding fathers warned us about. Looking at number 2, all banks and bankers should be subject to the laws of their respective countries. That seems very simple, very logical, but nowadays they are not subject to any of the laws of a country. Why did we allow them to do this? Look at number 3. This is absolutely necessary. Prohibit the charging of interest by any bank. This question of usury, exorbitant interest rates. This is enslavement. It's a highly immoral practice that enslaves individuals, it enslaves companies, it enslaves entire nations. This must be prohibited by law. And these bankers must be subject to the governments. Oh, look, that's number 4. Economic power should be subject to political power. These bankers, they need to be subject to the laws of the land and not do whatever they please so that they can control everyone. I mean, it's logical, but people are so afraid of this little group of psychotic individuals because they hold all the money, because they've taken control of the money and the media. But we need to deal with this. And point number 5, place the 3 branches of government in control. The executive, legislative, and judicial. We have this in our governmental system. But if we have politicians there who don't respect or even know what the founding fathers were about, then it doesn't work as well as it could. What happens is these economically powerful people, they dominate the politicians so that the politicians end up serving these psychotic individuals instead of representing the people. So this is our problem. The essence of our problem is the despotism that is happening through a very corrupt and immoral financial system and unjust laws that flourish around this so that they can be immoral legally. This is craziness. It's absolute craziness. And looking at the observation at the bottom, all peoples need to be aware of these facts. These are relevant to any nation. How to avoid despotism. Here it is. These are the solutions. If you can have the courage enough to implement these solutions, then we will regain our liberty, which our founding fathers founded for us, and we lost it. So let's see if we still have this psychogenetic inheritance as Americans who insist on having the liberty to be able to help our fellow man. This altruistic philosophy of life in acting in benefit of others. This Christian philosophy of loving one another and helping each other, because then everything grows. As the late President Kennedy once said, I'm not interested in giving a larger piece of the pie to certain people. I'm interested in making the pie larger for everyone. How does this happen? It's a very interesting way of putting this philosophy of life. When we work in benefit of each other, then everyone benefits. This Christian philosophy that Christ brought to us, it's the only one that works for us because it's the only one that is in harmony with our being. I'm Gilbert Gambucci, and this is Living Eternity Now. See you again.